All right, it's time for us to start, maybe just a half minute before. Uh, Real quick before we have our prayer, and John, you got a mic? Who else has a mic? Do you just have both of them right now, or Peyton has one? Okay. I'm going to get John Clemens to lead us in prayer here in a minute. Update on Katie. Today is pretty much the same. That's why there's not been a lot of updates, but that's a positive. I think that's a thing to keep in mind. Saw her x-rays yesterday, a couple days apart, and her lungs are starting to clear up, and that's a tremendous blessing. And there's a lot of technical things with all of that. One of those is the peak number of the vent. They used to not want to go above 12 because their lungs were so stiff it would highly pressurize and cause problems. Now that they're starting to loosen up, they want to get up to 20 and then work their way back down. She's been up to 16 so far, which is tremendously good. So there's a lot of things like that are just really, really positive things. When they put on her back yesterday, she did not tolerate that. They're going to try again today, more than likely, to do that. And if they could just do that for 5 minutes and then flip her back over, that actually helps the lungs tremendously. I'm just going to tell you real quick that you can't overestimate what's occurred since Wednesday night. I don't know that we put this in the email, but Thursday morning, the doctors were making them decide whether to resuscitate her or not. And within hours, doctors were asking, well, what's different? What's happened? And one of the nurses actually said, Jesus in prayer. And so there's a tremendous amount of just testimony going on through Katie right now. And so Austin has said multiple times, whatever it is y'all are doing, just keep doing it. So that's good news. We have a long way to go, though, and I think that's the thing to caution us, is that while we are very encouraged, there is a tremendous journey ahead. And so we just continually pray, and we just hope for those just small, encouraging victories along the way. And so that's what we hope for, and that's what God has given us so far. So for class, John, if you will lead us in prayer, and then we'll get into our class in James 4.
Our Lord and our God, you are so good. You are the one true and living God. And first and foremost, we always come before you to recognize you as our Lord, to praise you, to honor you, and glorify you. Dear God, our prayer above all else is that everything that we do, that we would do to your glory and to your honor. That our lives, our speech, our prayers, our studies, everything would be to your glory, to your honor, and according to your will. Dear God, we just want to thank you for this avenue of prayer that you've given us. Thank you that we can come to you as your children, calling you our Father, and reaching out and praying to you, asking these big petitions, knowing how much you love us and that you want to give us all these good things. Dear God, our prayer continues to be for Katie. First, we thank you for hearing our prayers as we've all been praying this last week. We ask that you continue to hear our prayers and you continue to heal her. We acknowledge what you have done so far, and we thank you for answering our prayer, for hearing our prayer, our petition. But we ask that you help us to continue to pray, to continue to be diligent in pestering you with our prayers about Katie, that you would continue to heal her. Because, dear God, as we've said before, she has work to do in your kingdom. as a wife, as a mother of small children, and as a light to a lost and dying generation. We ask that you return her to her health so that she can be that servant, that worker in your kingdom. Dear God, we just praise you, honor you, and glorify you, and ask you again to help us be diligent, continue to pray for Katie, each one of us pestering you with our prayers. Dear God, we have the faith. We know that you can heal her. Our petition is that you would heal her, restore her to her health. As you can do it, we know we have the faith, and we ask you this. Dear God, now as we go into this study, we just ask that we can spend this time reflecting on your word, reflecting on your goodness, reflecting on your greatness, and that we can understand what your word has to say to us as we study this book of James, that we could understand it, and that through this understanding we might be better servants, living our lives as workers in your kingdom according to your will. Dear God, this is our prayer. We're asking these prayers by the authority of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right, so as we begin in James 4, we're in verse 11. One of the questions you were asked, and by the way, questions for next week are in the back. When you look for the questions, they're on the table to my left, your right as you enter, and they're in the same holder as the bulletin. So, what is verses 11 and 12 about? Let's get to that first. What's verse 11 and 12 about? And by the way, remember we have microphones here. We've got two runners. So what is verse 11 and 12 about? Okay, got Vincent back here. He's got his hand up.
It's about judgment against your brother.
Okay. Judgment against your brother. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeper here in a minute. The question becomes with that idea, how does that fit into the book? And one of the questions you were asked is, how does that tie to the section before this? In fact, where does it fit? That's a big question. Do you see any connection to the section before, or maybe a couple of sections before this where we were? If you do, you raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you, Peyton or John. We want people that are joining us from home to be able to listen and hear your comments. What's the connection between these two verses, perhaps to a previous section? Everybody's awake this morning? We feel like I need to make a stretch and wake up a little bit. Let me say this. This is an interesting question because there's a lot of debate about where this fits. Is it a transition starting with verse 11? Some people will put it in verses 13 through 5, 6 obviously go together. We'll get to that. But some would include verses 11 and 12 in that section that deals with arrogance and a failure to rely on God. The other way to look at this is that this fits into the context of the community conflict that really started back in chapter 3 and verse 1 about not becoming teachers because of the stricter judgment. And there is somewhat of an inclusio, which just means that it's a kind of a bookends that repeat or tie together. They can contrast or they can be the same. But there seems to be an inclusio with this, with chapter 3 and verse 1, this admonition of teachers and the following passages about controlling the tongue. Because certainly, verses 11 and 12 are sins of the tongue in this context. And so from that standpoint, it's kind of interesting to see as well. I think what's interesting is this idea here in chapter 4 and verses 11 and 12 about speaking evil against one another. This idea of speaking evil against others is often linked with other things in the New Testament and even in Jewish tradition. For instance, speaking evil in 2 Corinthians 12 and in 1 Peter 2 is linked to jealousy. And in 2 Corinthians 12, it's also linked to selfishness. And if you think about that, that ties us back to chapter 4 earlier, at the beginning of chapter 3, I guess, starting in verse 13 or so. Also, in the apocryphal books, the Psalms of Solomon attaches it to quarreling, which again is that section we've just left. And also the Testament of Gad ties it to pride. And so when you think about this speaking evil being tied in these texts, both apocryphal Jewish writings and the New Testament, with selfish ambition and jealousy and quarreling and pride, it kind of seems to fit into that whole section from chapter 3 all the way to now, almost as if this is a concluding kind of statement. And we'll see how that, I think, all fits together in this section in a moment. And also forms somewhat of a transition to the section ahead that is dealing with arrogance in a couple of different ways. Get a mic to Joe real quick. Joe?
Yeah, I think, haven't really considered that, but you do see when you're going through chapter 5 that he keeps coming back to this sin of how we speak, and he talks about grumbling against each other. He talks about swearing an oath rather than just being yes and no people. And then he talks about prayer. So he moves to there's a lot of speech driven kind of thoughts through this whole section here. And I don't know about tying it. It's a fairly short book, so it all ties. But
yeah, it's interesting when we get into these discussions about trying to divide this context of this much larger book up into these little sections. Obviously, all of that goes back to chapter 3. And you think about how he goes from this slander, which we'll talk about, this speaking evil, really slander against each other, or judging, depending on your translation, and then taking oaths, and we've talked about cursing earlier, and then prayer. You obviously ought to be reminded of that whole bitter water, fresh water discussion at the end of the sins of the tongue thing, and how James is really expanding upon that going forward. And certainly, one of the things about this book is just there's so many recurring kind of themes throughout the book that he hits and then leaves, and hits and comes away. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about this is that this idea of judging here also corresponds with chapter 2 thematically in verses 8 through 13. If you turn back over there just to remind ourselves about that. But in chapter 2 and verse 8, after that sin of partiality, this section there, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you're committing sin. So you have this really ties into this too. And it ties into a particular text in the Old Law, in the Hebrew Bible, in Leviticus chapter 19. Because in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 16, there the law of Moses says, you shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Well, if you look at verses 11 and 12, he begins with this speaking evil, which is the same idea of slander, by the way. Speaking evil against your brother, and he ends in verse 12 by saying what? He no longer references brother, but who are you to judge your neighbor? He switches terms there in the same way that Leviticus 19 does. And so that's interesting as well. By the way, in Leviticus 19, we'll see this in a moment, there's other verses in that same text that James ties in directly in other places in James. Which, by the way, is always interesting to me in these books, where, if I were to tell you that we're going to study Leviticus, everybody groans, because who wants to study Leviticus? And then when you say James, and we're going to dive deep into James, everybody loves James. And what's funny is James really ties into Leviticus a lot, right? And sometimes it's just interesting to see how we view those two things so differently. There is, however, a definite change in tone from 6 through 10, and we get a mic to Chris, from 6 through 10 and verse 11, because in 6 through 10, he addressed these people as adulterers and sinners, and we talked about how it was harsh, there was a call to repentance. Now in verse 11, he's back to brothers. So there's obviously a switch in the way he's addressing that, and I think that's intentional. Well, we'll see that in a moment. Chris?
I think what you're saying earlier, there's a I keep seeing ties back to the same pattern in Matthew 5, 6, 7, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus, when talking to the Pharisees, he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men. And then that leads into having that attitude. He says that leads into judging your brother. And he says, don't be that hypocritical judgment. Just be a doer of the law. And then he kind of sums it up with what you just said. The verse back in chapter 2 of James is similar when he says in Matthew 7, therefore treat others the way you want to be treated and fulfill the royal law. And so it seems to be the same kind of pattern.
Yeah, and I think what that really shows is how much, and we know this from the study of the Sermon on the Mount, how much the Sermon on the Mount ties back to the law. And that's really what Jesus is focusing on. And, you know, what Jesus is showing there is, I think, the expectations under that law and under the gospel aren't as different as we often want to make them. God's expectations have really been the same as far as what he expects men to behave like. What's different is redemption and the sacrifice and those things. But what is not different is God's expectation of what you look like and how you behave and how you treat other people. Those things are consistent, honestly, from dispensation to dispensation. That was God's expectation even before the law of Moses, I think. Even what we come to call the patriarchal law. He expects you to treat people that way. And we see that in the way people are blessed, like Abraham, who entertained strangers, right? He put other people first. And all that, if we wanted to get really deep, and we're getting a little sidetracked here, all that goes back to what we talked a couple Sundays ago about being prophet, priest, and king. That's really what all that ties back to, that behavior. Get Joe and Mike here if we can, guys. And that's our job, to show the world the glory and the love and the power and majesty of Christ as his priests and kings on earth.
Yeah, James in one verse, and that's back in chapter 2, and I can't remember the verse, but so speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law of liberty.
Yeah.
And that really summarizes to me, if you're going to pull one verse out of James and say, what's it about? So speak and so act as to be.
Yeah, and what James is getting back to after this call for repentance in 6 through 10 of chapter 4 is he's getting back to this idea of acting the right way. Practical encouragement of, here's what the Christian walk looks like. And what you also see in this, going back to this section here, verses 11 through 17 here, you see also that James ties that idea to obedience strongly. He doesn't take the law of liberty to be something that you have the liberty to choose whether you follow or not. That's not the way he views that, like some do today. He talks about the law of liberty, but there is an expectation of obedience tied to that directly, which is why you're going to be judged. You're going to be judged on how you act according to that law. And so I think that's really important and powerful. Well, what this focus is here, by the way, is really the idea of slander. And this Greek word is used, I'm not going to even try to say it, but it's used in the Septuagint in the New Testament in multiple ways. Numbers 21 in the Septuagint, questioning authority. Psalm 101, secret slander or talebearing. 1 Peter 2 and 1 Peter 3, false accusations, which probably is more closely related to what we're talking about here. There's not a specific charge of wrongdoing with this idea of speaking evil or slander in verse 11, but I think we could put this in the context of chapter 3 and chapter 4, and what we've been looking at is this community problems that he's been dealing with, largely that deal with, starting in verse 13, quarrels and fighting amongst themselves. And as I think it was Moo pointed out, that this quarreling often leads in our lives. When we get into disagreements, it is rather common, isn't it, for that to lead to slander on our part in order to win the argument. How often do we see that? In fact, that was one of the downsides eventually of the great debates several years ago, is so often they would leave the study that was really intended and diving into the issues, and it would get into ad hominem attacks, personal attacks, slander in that sense. And so from that standpoint, that seems to be really something that connects in that section there. What is interesting is this idea that he has here in verse 11, that if you do this against your brother, if you slander your brother, you're actually slandering the law. And that's interesting to think about. And this is where Leviticus 19 comes into play. Listen to what verse 16 says again. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So that's a direct connection to verse 11. Listen to verse 18. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Right? Well, that's the royal law of chapter 2, right? Now listen to verse 15. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor, defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. What does that remind you of? Chapter 2, in the first, 10, 11, 12 verses there, it deals with partiality. I mean, what you see here is a heavy reference in chapter 2 and here in chapter 4 to these 3 verses in Leviticus 19. And I think we're supposed to make this connection, if you will, in this idea of, well, how is it that you're judging the law? Well, in the process of this book, James has referred to 3 verses in 1 chapter in Leviticus. And he's repeatedly pointing to the law and pointing to the law and pointing to the law. Well, what do they have in common? Well, the first thing is, I think what he's really saying is, when you don't keep the law, you deny the law's authority. What's the specific law that ties all of this together, though? What's the specific law that ties slander and partiality together? All 3 verses mention one word in Leviticus 19. Neighbor. And what really ties all this together is what he's talking about. I think what he's talking about, really, this law is ultimately the law of Moses. But I think what really we need to see is the royal law. And we often talk about how the law of Moses, Jesus said, could be summed up in 2 ways. What were those 2 ways? Love who first? What was the first law? Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. What was the second one? Love your neighbor as yourself. And what he's saying here in verses 11 and 12 is, when you slander your neighbor, you're judging the law, specifically loving your neighbor as yourself. You're judging that law to be inadequate because you're not keeping it. And so when you fail to love your neighbor, you're judging the law to be wrong, and you're slandering the law in the process. And the second thing you're doing is you're judging others infringes on God's right as the lawgiver and the judge. That you're standing in the place of God when you do this. Now, let's make sure we understand. We'll get to this in a moment about fellowship and what does this mean further down the road. Because I think that always comes up into this. Well, wait a minute. No judging at all. And that's how Matthew 7 is actually applied a lot of times. So I think we need to kind of understand that, and we will here in just a moment. In verse 12 is where he comes to this idea that this judging of the law infringes on the rights of the lawgiver. And this is where we have this idea of Matthew 7 comes into play. Judge not lest you be judged. And the question always comes in to say, well, how far does that extend? What does that mean? Does that mean, as Christians, we never make any judgments at all? Is that what that means? I would tell you I don't think that's what that means, because we're actually told, Jesus says, to judge with righteous judgment. So there are some judgments we have to make. And even in regards to each other, how can I, as Paul tells me, to go and restore one who has fallen away? How can I go restore someone in sin if I can't first judge them to be in sin, right? I mean, there is implications throughout that we have to make some judgments. And can we determine fellowship? Well, this is not about Christians using proper discernment. Nor is this, verse 11 and 12, about even the community of Christians using proper discernment and determining even fellowship based on one's obedience to the law of liberty and the standards of faith. But I think what is being rebuked here is the use of judgment in a form of jealousy and selfishness and quarreling, and that gets us back to the context of what we've been talking about, specifically in chapter 4. By the way, another passage that would force us to make judgments, 1 Corinthians 5 and 1 Corinthians 6, both talk about, 1 Corinthians 5, here they didn't judge a brother to be in some immorality, and Paul condemns them for that. You've got to make that judgment. And in 1 Corinthians 6, don't go to people outside the church to make judgments. Go to the men, the elders specifically, let them make judgments. There are judgments that are commanded to be made. What is not to be done here is this kind of judgment, this speaking evil, slander, which is done with a completely different motivation than those other texts we're talking about. Scott?
Yeah, and right at the end there, you were talking about the motivation. I mean, ultimately, before this, we're talking about arrogance, right? We're talking about humility. These are the factors that make this different in regards to that judgment.
Right. And a good illustration of that, by the way, I think is Romans 14. Where Romans 14 dives into these purity laws, ritual laws of meat specifically. And in verses 3 and 4, he says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats. That's the context and the idea of verses 11 and 12 here. And in verse 4, Paul says, who are you to pass judgment on the servant or of another? It says, before his own master that he stands or falls. And in verses 10 through 13, he repeats that idea. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? So it is that idea that I think is being seen here. Now, when we plug this into the context, and what I'm going to do is it's going to hop around a little bit because James is kind of this, he hops around quite a bit. But I think when you put it into the context here, what I'm going to outline of you this section, it makes a little bit of sense. So we begin back in chapter 3 in verses 13 through 18. He talks about there that bitter and selfish spirit that was among the community there. And he condemns that. And then in chapter 4, in the first couple of verses, he talks about how that led to quarrels among themselves within the community. There was this fighting amongst themselves. And that ties back to then this failure to control the tongue, which started back in chapter 3 in verses 1 through 12, then continues here in chapter 4 in verses 11 through 12. And as Joe's pointed out, it's going to be reiterated a couple of other times, the failure to control the tongue. But in this specific context, this quarreling, failing to control your tongue, which is a manifestation of the worldly spirit that is among their community that he talks about in chapter 3 and in chapter 4, that then he talked about in chapter 3 should be replaced with the wisdom from above and not the wisdom that is false wisdom. And that behavior, the behavior of chapter 4 there, the quarreling, the false wisdom, the slander here, all of that really is incompatible with God's desire for their allegiance. And remember, this is the whole section where he's talked about double-mindedness, this failure to be fully allegiant to Christ because you're more tied to and loyal to the worldly views and the worldly approaches. Which then all centers back to kind of the meat of this section, which is chapter 4 and verses 6 through 10, that if you'll just repent, God's grace will take care of all of this if you'll turn to Him. And in that sense, that's where I think chapter 4, verses 11 12 fits in that previous context. Hopefully that made sense, even though we kind of hop around a little bit. Any thoughts or comments before we jump to verse 13 and get into that section? Any thoughts? I need a mic to Joe. We got Joe up here. And anybody else want to follow Joe before we get to the next section? Joe?
Yeah, I think the easy way to see the difference between judgment is the end result of the one making the judgment. If it's out of jealousy or it's out of a power type thing, you're trying to make somebody do something that you want them to do just because you want them to do it, then that's evil.
Right.
But if you're trying to, if your efforts are from a pure heart to lift someone up out of sin, it's a totally different motivation.
Correct.
And it's an attempt to restore rather than an attempt to push down or tear down.
Yeah, and I'll add, I didn't say this, but I think in this context, there's also an implication that this judgment's not based on the law, necessarily. Because that's part of what makes it a judgment against the law, is they're judging from their own perspective, kind of, it seems implied, without regard to what the law is actually saying. And I think that's part of this discussion as well, which is part of the judgment of the law as well. So to keep it focused on the law rather than, and by the way, just to be honest, Romans 14 is a big part of this discussion, I think, when you think about that. Because how many times in discussions that ultimately are Romans 14 issues do you have somebody who's judging another brother about something that, quite frankly, is just a matter of doubt? We use opinion normally. I think that's actually a bad word, because Paul even talks about that's a better term to use than opinion. Although what ends up happening is we form opinions based off of what offends us, and offend is not sin in our language like it is in biblical terms, but offend just means I just don't like what you do, and you've offended me. And because you've offended me, now I'm upset, and now you got to do what I say because you're offending me. That's not the context of Romans 14 at all. And that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is, quite honestly, is just having problems between one another about things that there's doubts about. And when you start judging and dividing, that's specifically the context of Romans 14, like about meat. What really was at the core of that is somebody doubted you could eat that meat and not be sinning. While others, like Peter, had learned, don't call anything unclean. Which, by the way, I'm thankful for, because I love pork. All right? I like bacon. And if you were under those laws, you couldn't have that. And so from that standpoint, when you think about Romans 14, if you love bacon, just think of how thankful you are that Romans 14 is in the Bible, because it allows you to eat it. Because there are some people that still observe the purity laws today. But kind of joking with the bacon, but I think that gets us to understand what really is at here. This is not, by the way, Romans 14 and this is not about whether somebody has been obedient in, let's say, how they are saved. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about whether or not baptism is essential for salvation. That's not the kind of judgment this is talking about, just to be clear. This is talking about things like whether you read from the King James or the ESV. That's what we're talking about here, those kind of things. Which, by the way, if you use the King James, you're just wrong. I'm kidding. So let's move on to chapter 4 in verse 13, and we'll have time together to kind of go through this. There's no doubt this is a new section, because he starts off again with this, "Come now, you who say." And there is no doubt that this section ties to the first section of chapter 5. Look at verse 13. "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town." Look at chapter 5 and verse 1. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." This "come now" kind of formulaic thing was common, and James he's used this a couple times, but this obviously is tying these two sections together. And the question becomes with that is, what is this section about then? This is a new section. What is this new section about in verses 13 through 17? Raise your hand if you've got an idea there. Could be a couple of ways to explain that. Okay, well, I'll explain it. I'll push us along a little bit. It really is an arrogant worldview, removing God from life. And this is how these two sections tie together. In verses 13 through 17, it's removing God from life because of your self-reliance. And in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 5, it's self-indulgence that fills in there. Now, I will tell you that I think verses 7 through 11 specifically are part of this section. I didn't put that up there because it's essentially the answer to these two problems. How do you handle this arrogant worldview that you don't need God? What's the answer to that? Well, in chapter 5, they're starting verse 7, it's suffering and being patient and learning to depend on God. It's the reversal of these two things. In both of these sections, there is an underlying issue that's not named specifically here in this section, but is in verses 1 through 6, and that's wealth. Verse 1, it starts off with, "Come now, you rich folks," it's kind of how it starts. And in verses 13 through 17, there's no kind of condemnation of riches specifically, like in chapter 5. But the context of chapter 4 and verses 13 through 17 are people who are planning to go somewhere and to profit financially. In fact, the focus of that is their financial profit and their determination that they will financially profit. And it is likely that this is speaking about merchants here in verses 13 through 17. And we'll see that a little bit more in a moment. The question comes out. This is a question you were asked to be prepared to discuss. So hopefully you got the lesson and did that. Are these Christians in chapter 4 and verses 13 through 17? We'll deal with verses 1 through 6 of chapter 5, and I'll tell you the answer is not necessarily the same in those two sections. But in this section, do you think these folks in verses 13 through 17 are Christians or not? So, if you want to go first, be bold, be brave, raise your hand, we'll get a mic to you. I have no volunteers so far. Chris, I got a mic over to Chris.
I think it certainly can be.
Okay.
I think that's the whole struggle of trying to not be one who lives in the world and try to be that fence rider and struggle between the two, serving two masters, loving one and hating the other. I think that's the whole point of the struggle, is that we've got to, when Jesus says to deny yourself, I think that's the whole point of knowing the right thing to do and
Right.
failing to do it. And like you said, kind of taking the control on your own and being your own king and self-indulging and self-reliance and that whole aspect. It's a struggle that we all deal with. I think that comes down to faith in the end.
Okay, great thoughts. Anybody else? I got Terry Reed right here.
I said early Christians.
Okay.
I think James is trying to teach them to look at things differently than they have looked at in the past. A lot of this is all new to them, and I think they're still learning, and so I said early Christians.
Okay. Okay, Chuck?
I think it ties into the previous verses about your conduct, between Christians. You don't slander your brother, and then also, what is your focus on your life? Is it material things like Chris was talking about? It's just how a Christian should act.
Okay, good thoughts. Anybody else? All right. I think one of the things that's interesting in this section is the "come now you who say." I think that's what makes this difficult. Because what's missing from that statement that he's used a lot? Brothers. We've seen that brothers statement said a lot, and that's missing from this section, which seems odd. And at the same time, there's some pretty heavy language here in verses 14 and 15, there where he talks about, do you not know what tomorrow will bring? What is your life? Your mist that appears for a little time then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Verse 17, if you know what's right and don't do it, it's sin. Honestly, that seems odd for James to say to a group of non-Christians, doesn't it? That seems, do you want a mic? Are you raising your hand? Okay, give me a mic up here. Joe. And let me say, I think maybe James is intentionally ambiguous here. Maybe that's part of what's going on, because I think all of this applies to all of us, regardless of where you're at in life. But I do think it does apply to Christians in this context. And if you remember back at the beginning, we talked about how, yes, in a sense, these are people in the diaspora, Jewish scattered people, persecuted, who many of them have lost everything that they have because of the persecution. And they're restarting life in different places, and James is encouraging them. But to assume that all of them were just strictly in poverty would not be the way to assume, largely because of this text. Because I think what also could plug into this is those Jewish people who've been relocated, and this was their former life, the merchant idea. And James is saying, before you fall back into that, here's the perspective. Joe?
To me, it's just kind of a practical thing to me. Why would anyone who's not part of the diaspora even be reading James? Why would that even be his audience to start with? It would be those who had been chased off out of Jerusalem because of their faith in Christ. Now they're struggling, obviously, clearly.
Right.
That it's struggling to be Christ-like, and he's pointing that out.
Yeah, good thoughts. I lean towards Christians, okay? I lean towards Christians. I could go a lot in depth here. We got about 5 minutes. We may not get through all of this. I'm not going to rush, but at the same time, and I may go a little bit later. We need to talk about giving us some more time. Anyway, it was common for people at this time to travel among what used to be the Hellenistic cities, to trade openly in commerce, and to do so to make a profit. I think the problem is sometimes if you're not careful, you could take this section and you could determine here that this is actually a warning against profit. And that's not what James is doing. He is not rebuking people for planning for the future. That's not what is going on here. He is rebuking them for their self-confidence about the future. And he specifically gets into this because what he really gets into is this idea of, well, how do you know what's going to happen? That's really the idea here is, how can you, being frail human beings, whose life is so short like a vapor, how do you know what the future holds? How can you determine what is going to happen? Because illness, death, the return of Jesus, that all can make any of your plans fall apart. And you have no control over any of those things. By the way, recurring biblical thing quickly, there's a lot of places. Proverbs 27 verse 1, do not boast about tomorrow, but you do not know what the day may bring. Okay? And also in that, in Luke 12 and verse 15, one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. You ought to tie that back to this section, because this is all tied to their idea of what they're going to have. What's interesting about that 12 and verse 15 verse is the story he tells starting in verse 16 through 20. He talks about in verse 15, life is not about your possessions. Then he tells the story in verses 16 through 20 about the man who was going to tear down his barns to build bigger barns. And that is an exact parallel to this story, isn't it? He had plans. He was going to make money by what he was going to do. He was planning for the future. He already knew he needed bigger barns. And yet, what does Jesus say to that man in verse 20? Your life is required of you tonight. And what was the point that Jesus made in that story? The same point James is making. You don't know what the future holds. You become arrogant and you become self-reliant in your planning and your profit, and I'm going to go do this or I'm going to do that, I'm going to go to town and do this or that. All of that revolves around this financial kind of thing. And instead, he says what you ought to say is, if the Lord wills. Now, this became known as the Jacobean condition. What's funny about that is, this is not something that's tied directly to James. I mean, think about the Lord's Prayer, the model prayer. What does Jesus say there in the model prayer? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I mean, this is not a foreign concept. This idea of the Lord's will being done is something that is quite common, goes over and over. I think one of the things to keep in mind here is that James is not encouraging some vain repetition of this statement. And there's some people who take that, well, if the Lord wills, that's not what he's saying here. I think what he's saying is two things. First, that we should approach life with this idea. Well, if the Lord allows this to happen, this is what we're planning on doing. Not so much as a statement, but as your perspective and the way you think about life. James is not saying that if you ask me what I'm going to do this week, I'm going to tell you, well, on Tuesday, my mom's getting her first vaccine, and I'm wrong for saying it that way. James is not saying I have to say, you go, what's going on Tuesday, Terry? Well, if the Lord wills, my mom will get her first vaccine. That's not what's being said here. What is being said here is that your perspective and thought is knowing and realizing that you are dependent on God for your future plans. I think the second part of this is that our plans should be in accordance with the Lord's will that we already know. Because I can tell you this much I know, and this gets back to obedience, the law of liberty, judging, and all those things we talked about. If I do something I know is in a direct contradiction to the Lord's will in Scripture, guess what? It ain't going to happen. And Satan may allow it to happen for a while, but it's not going to happen in the way that glorifies God, I guess is the way to make sure we understand that. The real problem in all this is the arrogant boasting of verse 16. That's the real focus of all of this is verse 16. And he qualifies this boasting by being arrogant, because the word for boasting, by the way, in the Greek language can be positive or negative. What is important is what you're boasting in. And here, by pointing out it's arrogant, the point is you're boasting in yourself. Before I get to that, this one kind of geeky reference. This was called Hybris in the Greek. Again, I'm not good at pronunciation. I will tell you this. This is the same form of arrogance that in the Iliad, Homer says is what has been destructive to Achilles. He attributes the same thing. And to wrap this up, what Moo here finally got you one Moo quote at the end of class. James is rebuking not people of the world, but Christians. He warns, therefore, of the tendency of the world to press us into its mold by leading us, perhaps subtly, to begin assuming that we control the duration and direction of our lives. Such an attitude is simply inconsistent with a Christian worldview in which there is a God who sovereignly directs the course of human affairs. Now, we could talk about what that sovereign direction of human affairs looks like, and we don't want to take that too far where we're Calvinistic in that approach. But I think we need to realize God is still involved in the human affairs of this world. And we still need to depend on that. We're just out of time. We'll pick up with verse 17. Get the questions in the back. And look carefully as we prepare for Sunday at what verse 17, how that fits in with all of this. That's an interesting question as well. Look forward to it. Thanks for your participation this morning.